Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of the Qarawiyyin podcast. We're really excited to be recording this episode. I'm happy to be joined by my two co-hosts. I'm here with Aisha H. and Amina. And how are you guys doing today?
Assalamu alaikum. All good, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Very good, alhamdulillah. It's nice to see you guys. I feel like it's been a minute since we recorded. I don't know, perhaps it's just my idea of time, first podcast of 2022.
Yeah.
It does feel long, right?
Yeah, it's been a minute, but we're back with a very exciting topic. We're here discussing a book that was recently published, written by Dr. Usaama Al-Azami, titled Islam and the Arab Revolutions. And we're going to delve much more deeply into a lot of the topics in this book, but just for like a brief overview of what it's about, Dr. Al-Azami is focusing primarily on Egypt during the Arab Spring, although he does touch upon like a few other countries and their like events that took place at the same time, and specifically focusing on the role of prominent religious scholars throughout the revolution, those who supported it, those who opposed the revolution, how they, just their discourse in relation to the governments themselves and also to the people, their conversations with each other. But yeah, that's a kind of a broad overview. For some brief background on the author himself, Dr. Al-Azami is a lecturer at the University of Oxford in Oriental Studies. He writes mostly about like Islam and modernity, Islamist politics, very much related to topics in this book. And this is actually his first book. But yeah, I'll let you guys talk more about that too.
Yeah, no, mashallah. This was, I think all of us actually feel like this was one of the best books that we've read in a long time, right? It's on a very topical issue as well. I mean, just before we started, Amina was saying that, subhanAllah, it's been, now obviously over a decade, 11 years since the start of the Arab Spring, or at least the success of the Egyptian Revolution, which is one of the primary focuses of the book this month being February. And I think that it's a well-timed book, because I don't know about you guys, but I remember last year when it was a decade had passed, that there were all of these articles that were coming out talking about the Arab Spring 10 years on. There were a lot of positions that I felt were very recycled. I think there was a certain rhetoric that people were talking about, and I think it's a topic that's been exhausted in many dimensions, but the angle that he's addressing in this book is quite unique. He's specifically looking at the role of the ulama. The kind of tagline, or the subheading, I guess, of the book is the ulama between democracy and autocracy. But I think that as well, the fact that this book is obviously critical of some scholars, but he spoke about how, he's benefited from many of these shuyukh in particular areas, and he considers some of them his teachers. And I think that, again, obviously this is a sensitive issue to some people, particularly given that, when you're talking about something as drastic and great as political revolution, there's a lot at stake. But he gives all of these scholars the respect that they deserve as teachers, but at the same time acknowledges that, we as Muslims don't have this idea of infallibility. Of course, they can be criticized, and a decade on, we should be looking at their work and their actions and our own actions in order to really learn from this in the future.
Before we actually get into the content of the book, I think it would help to just review kind of the timeline of events that the book is based on, like the Egyptian Revolution, main turning points and whatnot.
Yeah, so the timeline of events will vary depending on what the focal point is. And that's actually on the charm of the book, actually, because the focus on the activities of the ulama in conjunction with the political events provides a whole different perspective. But to give a very cursory overview of the Egyptian Revolution and a very simplified outline for those who aren't completely aware, we have to maybe first start outside and look at the Arab Spring as a whole. Because it is in Tunisia where the worsening economic conditions pushed a Tunisian street vendor to set himself on fire out of this desperation to be heard and acknowledged. And it was this self-immolation of Muhammad Bouazizi that set off the Tunisian Revolution, where the people came to the streets to protest the very awful living conditions. And this ultimately led to the ousting of Ben Ali. And this essentially inspired hope around the Middle East, that there were people, there was hope in defeating the corrupt, but the people had a chance to change the conditions themselves, and they were not completely helpless. And to set precedent, so these sentiments then spread to the Egyptians, who for 3 decades had been ruled with an iron fist by Hosni Mubarak. And Mubarak was the fourth president of Egypt, and he came into power in a state of emergency. So when the anti-Mubarak protests were taking place in January 2011, they were calling out things like poor living standards and inflation and lack of political freedom and civil liberty and police brutality. And the people had seen what the Tunisians had done, and they thought, enough is enough. So they took to the streets, and after a very continuous and tremendous effort, Mubarak announced his resignation in February. So from that angle, the revolution was successful, alhamdulillah, but all in the story does not end there. And I remember at this time, Obama made a speech about the USA offering all the support it could in helping Egypt transition into a true democracy. But clearly the idea of democracy was not well received by everyone because, especially when that said democracy seemed to be favouring the Muslim Brotherhood. Because it was their candidate, Mohammed Morsi, who beat the military's preferred candidate in June 2012. And he appointed, Sisi as a commander-in-chief of the military and defence minister. So the following year was very difficult for Morsi, and the conditions for the people have not improved much either. So anti-Morsi protests did take place, and they were largely orchestrated by the military too. But this, ultimately led to a military coup spearheaded by Sisi, who removed Morsi from his position, took his place, and suspended the constitution. Now, Sisi rules with the same iron fist as Mubarak. He cracked down on opposition, imprisoned anyone who would dissent, and he just became a true face of authoritarianism. The UAE now pledges money to the coup regime, legitimizing it, and all the while its anti-Sisi protests are taking place, with civilians and scholars alike condemning the coup as an attack on their freedoms and rights. But to tackle this issue now, Sisi chose to crack down on the protests as a military force, and this may be one of the most memorable events and the most horrifying, which is the Rabat massacre, where thousands of Egyptians had gathered unarmed to peacefully protest the political situation, and they were met with bullets that the police just fired mercilessly. It's generally one of the most disturbing and barbaric events that have taken place in my lifetime. It was a bloodbath that took no consideration of who was the recipient of the gunfire. And it's been documented that at least 1,000 people were killed, but even that may be an underestimation. This all happened in front of the international media. It's just insane. But this essentially covers the main events, and now Sisi is still in power. There is still political repression, with very harsh treatment for those who oppose his tyranny. I read that actually, that a final event in this timeline would be the UAE classifying the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organisation in 2014. The significance of this will become more apparent as we unpack the various nominations, but all in all, I would say this is a very simplified outline of the last decade in Egypt.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good overview, Amina, because subhanAllah, like it's been a decade, even almost a decade now, subhanAllah, since the coup. So it's good to kind of remember it and get that timeline straight. And it's great that, Dr. Usaama as well delineates that in the book. But obviously, I think as you were saying, you remember the Arab Spring happening, and I think many listeners will also remember it happening, and it was definitely, a seminal point in my life and thinking, as it was for so many people, I think. And I think that because we've lived through that, it's really interesting reading books on a history that, we were witness to some degree. And I think that when, as I was reading the book, I really remembered the hope and the opportunity that everybody did feel as they saw people going into the streets and calling for change, and many of this change obviously being rooted in some kind of aspiration for Islam to manifest in the political sphere where it had been quashed in the past. And I think that the book did a really good job of capturing that spirit. And so for me now, like as I was saying, in the past year, having seen so many people, and subhanAllah, I think it's really tragic to me when I see so many more people jumping on this train of kind of really dismissing this whole past decade as a failure, or treat this incident as something, how could we have expected otherwise? I think sometimes people approach it as though they're almost kind of above it all, as, of course this was going to fail, and as though they knew this then. And this to me, it just seems very disingenuous. And I think that what's more important than pointing fingers at people or acting as though, we could have predicted any of this and anything of what has happened in the past 10 years. I think what's more important than that is to obviously honor people who made huge sacrifices during this time and learn lessons for the future. Definitely, I think one thing that hit me very hard reading it was the chronicling of the events in Rabat, as you said. And it was very kind of emotional reliving all of those incidents, because I don't know about you guys, perhaps, this was something particular to the media that I was watching at the time, but I felt that this was very downplayed in Western media, particularly in the early stages when it wasn't actually clear, obviously, how many people had died. There was conflicting narrations. But, even I was then kind of rewatching some of the media reports, and for many days after the massacre, it was talked about as a raid on a protest camp. And this is like such a huge misrepresentation, the idea of camp, as though these people are doing something there and they're protesting. It was a peaceful sit-in, and it was not a raid. Like, these people literally turned their guns on thousands and thousands of people, men, women, and children. And obviously then, yes, the numbers were very much underestimated. And still today, obviously, we don't know the exact figure. But I think that we know that the extent of the violence to a degree that we can say that, you know, and I never hear it said like this. And then I read it in Dr. Usama's book and I was like, wow, when you think about it like that, you know, more people died in Rabaa than in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And we think about that as a huge example of, you know, a government cracking down on a protest in a hugely unjust and violent and, you know, completely cruel way. And subhanAllah, sometimes I think that Rabaa obviously, you know, it doesn't get that remembrance and that attention that it deserves. So for me, that was something that particularly kind of stood out in his relaying of the events.
Yeah, definitely. The last point you mentioned about like just like recounting the events of Rabaa and like him doing it in detail was like the whole book was, I think, like really emotional to read, but that especially it made me start reflecting on like kind of like growing up during the Arab Spring and like how, you know, like my memories of it are kind of vague and blurry now, but one thing I remember for certain was that like we never faced these types of questions that come up in the book about like permissibility, validity of protests, justifications for not just their like regimes and their existence and their legitimacy like as rulers, but even like legitimacy for the massacres and things like that. Like everything just seemed so self-evident at the time that like the revolutions were valid, that the people were just like doing the bare minimum to fight for their rights, which was just like protesting peacefully. But I also want to talk about like my thoughts on the book as a whole before, again, we will inshallah like delve really like into specific points about the content. But again, not just about like documenting the Rabaa massacre or other events, but in general, the way he writes this book, it's very thoroughly referenced. And he just has this like transparency about like how he explains like where he got his evidence from and how he went about like finding the information and the citations that he's using. So he's really transparent about like his research methods, and he also does a good job of like both going like really deep into those primary sources of you know, breaking down like the speeches of ulama about before and after the Rabaa massacre. And then also he has a really good section talking about like the secondary literature that then discusses all the discourse around revolution and rebellion in the Sunni tradition. And also it comes out very clearly that Alami is preempting a lot of the criticism that's going to come towards the book, which is totally expected. He, again, like you mentioned, Aisha, he talks about his own training and gives context to where he's coming from, that he's not coming from like an outsider or oppositional standpoint necessarily, and that, yes, he's very well placed to be writing this book as somebody who's both familiar with and able to navigate the traditional Sunni sources about the issues discussed in the book when it comes to just like fiqh and hadith, but also, you know, in terms of his relationships to like these contemporary scholars. He avoids using a lot of like absolutist or declarative language when it comes to just giving his own interpretation of certain events. But I think he provides enough evidence before stating those interpretations that it leaves very little room for the readers to then accuse him of stretching things or reading an interpretation that's not there. And yeah, honestly, we were talking about this. I was like, are we biased? Do we just love this book because we love the topic so much and this is something that's very close to our hearts? And I think that, no, it's actually just a really well-written book. And it is one of the best books I've read in a long time.
So the strength of the book for me personally is the very sincere tone that Dr. Usama conveys throughout. This is a topic that is frequently discussed online, and most people do have a side they pick. And, you know, I most definitely do. And with the religious factor and you have the protectiveness of the ulama, and yeah, just the very real pain and trauma from the events of the Egyptian Revolution, this can evoke a very emotional response from all sides. And so the conversation is never really navigated in a manner that is fair. But arranging the discourse in an academic format, laying it out so comprehensively with the facts and figures in one place, so they can't really be misused, and without superimposing his own opinions to the best of his ability, because yeah, we all do that, it just makes this research that much more credible. And it ends up with the facts speaking for themselves. And I will add that I feel as if Dr. Azami does have a good track record or a reputation for just being fair in his analysis or trying to be as fair as he can. Me and Aisha saw him early this year and like 2 years ago as well. And his tone is always consistent throughout all of his academic activities. And, really just credit where credit is due, because this is something I really have definitely struggled with, especially in this context. So that's actually a very appreciated factor of this book. But, especially why I think this is such a good focus for a book, because no one is really following the scholars' actions so closely during political events. Because it's rather the politicians, because you don't really see the scholars as key actors in politics, especially in the modern day. But we hold them to a higher standard and trust them unconditionally sometimes, as people who are just, who are just and on the haqq. So now that we are reading it all together, there's almost a sense of delayed betrayal, but also a sense of pride hearing what certain scholars said at that time. especially when we note their influence in the politics. So it's just, I think it's a very important topic for a book, personally.
Yeah, definitely. I think that juxtaposition of, different scholarly perspectives was really, really useful. And I think that was kind of, an analysis of this whole, of this event that we haven't seen as yet. And I completely echo what you're saying about the sincere tone, because that's what makes this comparison not just some ooh, gotcha kind of study of trying to, point out where you were wrong here, but he was right there. It's actually a genuine attempt at trying to understand and locate these scholars' opinions and place it in the context of their background and their knowledge. I think as well, one thing that I liked about it is that as much as, like you're saying, Amina, this book is dealing with how that scholarly class, reacted to the revolutions and is locating their understanding in, obviously, through their theological positions and things like that. One thing that I thought was a really, really great contribution, and is, the fundamental argument of the book, it's kind of in the blurb as well, is really that he makes a very nuanced analysis of where their positions actually stem from. And in doing so, he deconstructs the labels that people even put on themselves or other people put on them, and kind of really examines what do they use to justify their positionality. Is their reasoning actually Islamic? Are they giving explanations that are justified from the tradition, or are they influenced by something more modern? And really, I think that's the crux of his argument that he makes. That is that people who enthusiastically, particularly on the counter-revolutionary side, the scholars that endorsed the counter-revolutionary actions of Sisi and the Egyptian army and, alongside the UAE and things like that, rather than attributing their arguments to, Islamic texts, and although they claimed to ground it in the tradition, their arguments are more closely related to the distinctly modern commitment to the authoritarian state. But at the same time, his analysis is very nuanced, and he sometimes highlights where other scholars also are more influenced by modern norms than they are by Islam. And there's a particular kind of contrast that he gives in one of the earlier chapters, where he looks at Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, obviously a very famous, Egyptian scholar now based in Qatar. He's obviously somebody who was pro the revolutions at the time and since then. And his understanding of, obviously, state sovereignty is that a state is legitimized by the people, believing in it, and that it's not undermined by the people criticizing it. That's very, quite a distinctly modern norm, that, it needs to be backed by the people, arguably. I'm not saying it's not Islamically justified, but it's also a modern norm. And he shows here how he's closer to kind of the international status quo, as it were. But then he contrasts with the view of Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib, who is the rector of Al-Azhar, who at the time was less enthusiastic about the protests, and then, came out on the counter-revolutionary side more staunchly following, after Mubarak was removed and Morsi came into his presidency. And he looks at how his understanding of the distinction between the political sphere being separate from the religious sphere is something that is, again, inherently more modern. So what is the foundation that these scholars are using? And for me, I just found it interesting that, very often, particularly, Western commentators, I have to say, they really try and make out that the ulama are always and only speaking from the position of religion, almost as though they cannot be influenced by any other considerations. And in doing so, they characterize a whole, discourse of Islam's position on revolution, or Islam's position on politics is this, the Sunni position on this is X. But actually, I think he shows very much how how certain modern concepts influence the scholars' response to certain events. Particularly, obviously, the modern concept of the nation state. Where does authority lie in the state, and the position of the ruler in that? That is very much key to how these scholars responded to those events. And so looking at it purely from a theological lens is not going to give you the answers as to why these scholars took this position. You have to look at it more broadly in the wider political discourse.
Also, actually, the pro and counter-revolutionary dichotomy is a really nice mode of comparison, as opposed to just neotrad versus Islamist only, because, we see a lot of overlap in political positions despite the theological differences. The only thing I will ask for, actually, but, Dr. Usaama mentions it himself that it's outside the scope of his research, but the omission of the Salafi perspective. The idea of democracy, the Madakhala view of obedience to the leaders, like how does Salafi scholars who are respected and knowledgeable react to the events of the Egyptian revolution? Especially as a lot of neo-trad scholars are generally critical of Salafism. Yet maybe they share more in common in this regard, so it may be worth unpacking the different groups that are mentioned within this monograph.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I really loved that part of the book. And obviously, many of this discussion is related to current affairs or more academic things. But I feel like in this regard, this is something that is very relevant to the Muslim community, where you have, unfortunately, a lot of labeling that goes on, and you have people chucking these labels around. And I find it honestly quite ironic, because the amount of time that, particularly I think this understanding of what it means to be a traditionalist or a neo-traditionalist is very much misunderstood. But Dr. Usaama does give some good definitions from the off.
Yeah, particularly, I mean, we can go through each of the denominations that he mentions and that he defines. And that later he also kind of breaks apart and shows that they don't perfectly align with the political dichotomies that we come up with. But first of all, this whole this term neo-traditionalism, I think it's important here to just emphasize that the terms here are used in Muslim community discourse in many, many different ways, and choosing to go with a certain definition for the sake of the current discussion, whether it's Azami doing that within his book or us doing that within the podcast episode, is not us, saying that this is the canonical only valid definition of these terms, but it's just that we need to use something to describe what we're talking about right now. So let's go ahead and define it. But yeah, neo-traditionalism here is talking about a very specific it's a religious trend, but with very obvious political characteristics, and that's what distinguishes this group of ulama in this discussion is their political. Later on, we'll see how that also is not it's not 100% true, but how Al-Dami defines it is by saying that neo-traditionalism may be described as a modern denomination of Sunnism that promotes adherence to the 4 Sunni schools of law, so the 4 madhahib, a preference for 2 of the 3 Sunni schools of theology, that would be the Maturidi and Ash'ari schools, and the practice of Sufism. But he crucially notes that in practice, the various modern denominations are far more imbricated than their less ideologically tolerant proponents might be willing to acknowledge. So that's a kind of a mouthful, but basically what he's saying is that the definition given here and the definition purported by people who identify with this label, who identify with this ulama, is that we identify with the 4 madhahib, or these schools of aqidah, and with the broad practice of tasawwuf, but that in practice, there's a lot of other Muslims who fit into those categories in some sense that people would toss out of the label of traditionalism or of neo-traditionalism. And that really the key here is that, the trend of neo-traditionalism that we're discussing in the context of the book, in the context of these political events, is exclusivist. And it's ideologically statist in the sense that it places a lot of credibility and legitimacy in the hands of the state and provides very little room for the people as a broader public, for the ummah to then oppose the state or to question it or to take any a very wide spectrum of means to then oppose the state or to change it or make demands of it. But that's kind of a broad definition of neo-traditionalists. Of course, there's the way they define themselves, and then there's, in the context of this book, where we're talking about but we'll see examples later also of people identifying with this school but also being characterized by certain political opinions and approaches.
Yeah, and then obviously I think as Amina was saying, then the other kind of camp in inverted commas as it is, because I'm not trying to put labels on people, like you said, these are things that are in flux to a great degree because of the way in which people practice them and the meanings that are attributed to them. But the other camp, for all intents and purposes, is obviously the Islamist groups and Islamist leaning scholars that he does refer to. This is a term that, again, subhanAllah, I feel very conflicted about using in general, because it has, I feel like it has a meaning to me as somebody part of the Muslim community who understands what people who identify as Islamist actually believe and the differences. And some of the differences are huge. This is really Islamist, I think, in general terms, is about Muslims who see a role for Islam in politics. But I think that today you cannot use this term without lumping all Muslim groups on a huge spectrum together under this one label. I mean, obviously, Dr. Usaama, he talks about this in the context of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is obviously one of the oldest Islamist organizations, again, if you want to use that term. Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt in the 1920s by Hassan al-Banna as the founder, and he is really talking about, that, and because obviously it has its history rooted in Egypt, he looks at them as the Muslim Brotherhood as the main representative of Islamism, quote unquote, in Egypt at the time. And he acknowledges that, this is something that is used frequently in the English language to refer to far too many groups of people. But because obviously many Muslims, and as I said, in the Muslim community, we use it ourselves, and in the Arabic language, it's used as, Islamiyun. It's come to be a term that we have in our vernacular. But at the same time, I think we should always be cautious of how this is used, like, in the mainstream, because it's hilarious to me that groups like, Al-Qaeda would be described as Islamist, the same way that, the AKP party in Turkey, the Justice and Development Party, described as Islamists, even though these are people that have drastically different views, but obviously try and infuse politics, or rather infuse Islam into their worldview in some way, shape or form. So for the intents and purposes of his book, he's looking at scholars who see a role for Islam in politics similar to that of the Muslim Brotherhood, similar to that vision. But I think that obviously, the colloquial, the usage, and definitely in the mainstream is a lot more complicated.
Yeah, so I think it's important to look at the diversity within the Muslim Brotherhood as well, because it's a predominantly non-violent movement, and it's been involved in a lot of social reform historically too. And within its first decade, it spread beyond Egypt and grew significantly. One of the more notable figures that some people may know includes Sayyid Qutb, and he introduced a more militant approach, and he may be the reason why many associate the Muslim Brotherhood with Islamist groups. I say that with air quotations because I feel like I'm using the language of the enemy, like groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And however, it also inspired political parties like Nahda in Tunisia, and another notable figure is Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudah, who's an absolute heavyweight in our tradition, a most prestigious scholar of Islam, so the reach is clearly very diverse. So then it's important to delineate what we mean by Islamist, because the mainstream very much associates it with aggression and intolerance, and whilst ISIS does fit that characterization, the Muslim Brotherhood, like Aisha mentioned, have almost polarizing visions. So how useful can a term be if it tries to encompass both? Is it supposed to encompass both, firstly, and more importantly, who finds such a term useful? The book breaks down a sermon by the scholar Rajab Zaki that he gave after the Rabaa massacre, and it is one of the most powerful things I've ever heard. He was a blind scholar, and whilst he had no official association with the Muslim Brotherhood, he echoed their sentiments in a very powerful speech. And he spoke of how Allah was the Almighty, and he addressed this very dark period for the Ummah and Egypt specifically. And he contemplated on the victories of the past, where tyranny was stamped out and justice prevailed and the rights and the freedoms of the people were protected. And he spoke in favour of the people and their concerns, and criticised the government and the scholars who supported them in the numerous injustices. He fixated on freedom and liberty, and this does not really fit into the Islamist agenda that is portrayed by the West. It's a seemingly liberal talking point. But Dr. Usaama points out quite rightly that the Islamist project has been engulfed by an Orientalist commentary. It superimposes the intolerance and militant nature of some onto those who are clearly undeserving of it, because of some overlapping concerns. But by that logic, the Muslim Brotherhood also overlaps with certain liberal ideologies, especially with regards to political freedom. Yet that would not afford the same opportunities the term Islamism does. Because there were actually even liberals who supported the massacres, because the protesters were mainly Muslim Brotherhood supporters. And even though there were just some people who were unaffiliated Egyptian civilians who wanted justice, but because quite simply Islamist equals bad. And I read an article recently actually about the online right and the Taliban, and the author refers to the Taliban as an Islamist terrorist organization, which even by American standards is quite questionable. But she also mentioned Islamists who co-opt wokeness and camouflage their agenda in the language of diversity and inclusion, which is probably referring to the Muslim Brotherhood, because they were definitely pro-UAE vibes. But a very basic understanding of both groups and their philosophy and approach sets them apart from the offset. And what exactly does Islamists convey here when the terrorist Taliban, the very specifically labelled terrorist Taliban, and the woke MB are so far apart on the spectrum yet somehow fit under the same umbrella? In the context of the Egyptian revolution, what stands out as most ironic to me is the pro-coup or the quietist neutral scholars and their involvement in classifying the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Be it the Azhari scholars or the Ulama working with the UAE, because when you blur the lines and lump militant jihadis and ikhwanis together under the pejorative label of Islamist, it becomes weaponized by the authoritarians, and it helps legitimize their deeds. They can take the same approach to terrorism and Islamism that the West has, from demonization to actual imprisonment and torture, because this is what the Islamist label affords you. And so you can see why so many people are okay with the all-encompassing nature of the term. And, Israel tried to label Islamic Relief, the charity, a supporter of terrorism. And in doing so, they seized the money, raided their offices, and just prevented them from doing their work. And Germany even cut funding to the Islamic Relief Organization due to its ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. So ultimately, this designation allows for the Egyptian authoritarian regime to suffocate its opposition and just essentially continue the authoritarian project without much challenge. Ali Gomaa would reinforce the apparent association of the Muslim Brotherhood and terrorist groups at every opportunity. It was akin to the West's war on terror strategy that counters extremism but targets only Muslims, but here targeting only Muslim Brotherhood. But it builds off the foundations that the West has already set. And most importantly, it makes it difficult to critique the Islamist project if it's never presented or represented accurately or fairly. As someone who is on the pro-revolution side, and having seen how the Arab Spring has played out, I do sometimes wonder, what little power the Islamist project wields at this current time. And just how so much of it is now just a topic of academic discussion or the focus of research in Western establishments. Just mostly just kept alive in activist circles. But it is difficult to critique someone that is so badly misrepresented, and especially when many of its critics are pretty awful too. Beyond the militant associations, on the other side of the spectrum, some of the critics, when focusing on the idea of the will of the people and democracy in relation to Islamism and Muslim Brotherhood, they make it seem as if it's some liberal endeavour that will, let the people vote in the same deviancy that exists in the West. As if like Sheikh Qaradawi, who's been citing Quran and Hadith continuously to oppose autocracy, will now just suddenly stop this when a democracy is established. They make democracy in the Western sense, not even democracy in the sense that these scholars want, seem as if it's the be-all end-all. And, we don't have to look too far at Saudi Arabia to see how well they are, preserving religion without democracy. Just back who you want, but at least call things by what, their name. And it is a pity because I do actually like the term Islamist if it was, used correctly, the way I want it to be used. That's one, maybe when we can cut through the noise, you can have a lot of fruitful conversations then, inshallah.
Yeah. It's like before you use it, you have to explain who it's referring to, which is, I guess you have to do that with all terms to an extent. But I think that Islamist is one that is just, like you said, largely defunct until you do that.
Yeah, it's especially contested. And it's like, that's why this is like a really important part of the conversation to like set up what comes up later. And just to preface the further discussion by saying that we're going to use these terms like the way that Al-Azami defines them in his book. In the first chapter.
Just to as well quickly add, as Amina said, Dr. Usaama does not talk about sort of Salafi groups in Egypt and their participation in kind of the revolution, and their scholars' commentary is not a particular focus in the book. But I feel like this is another term where, as we're just talking about contested terms, that I feel is very, again, subject to misinterpretation, especially obviously coming from the UK. I mean, you must have this as well. Whenever I meet people who are outside of the UK, people really have this opinion that the UK is very Salafi. And obviously, I think that there's definitely a Salafi influence in the UK that's very well documented. But people like to make out that everything and anything in the UK is Salafi influenced. And I think there's a huge lack of distinction between the different types, even, within Salafism. Like you mentioned, like Madkhalis, this is completely not the same as people who adhere more to like, a Salafi jihadi kind of mentality. At the same time, having like an Athari or, being of Ahl al-Hadith as opposed to being, Ashari or really madhab specific is not the same as being, anti-madhab and, having a really kind of particular view on how you take the Islamic tradition and what is the role of all of the scholars that we've had before. And so with all of these variations among different shuyukh, I think that one thing that the book highlights, not about Salafis in particular, but about these other camps, is that these theological opinions do not fit neatly into political categorizations. I think the book is a great case study of how after a certain point, these labels are actually useless. They're not as determinant as people think. And I think when you unthinkingly slap that label on, definitely as we're saying that, Western media is very guilty of when it comes to using, the term Islamist in particular, they miss so much, forget nuance, but even just understanding what do these people even stand for.
Yeah, about labels though, I do appreciate Dr. Osama's reason for referring to new trends as new trends, when most, and they themselves just see themselves as adherents of Sunni Islam. Because there is the implication that other denominations are not really Sunni or as Sunni as them, or just make them the default. I think it's due to that Salafis, or in the West at least, really make it really clear that they are Salafis, and refer to themselves as such, maybe to differentiate themselves from maybe what is considered the default today. But regardless, even neotrads are a product of modernity, so they are just another denomination within the umbrella of Sunni Islam.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to convey by calling them exclusivist, and is that it's very dangerous the way that they try to throw other people out of it,
which Salafis are guilty of as well, obviously, when they're you're not on the manhaj,
yeah, definitely. And absolutely. And Al-Azami mentions that immediately after he says that about neotrads, he's like, Salafis and quote unquote Islamists do the same thing. So it's something that goes both ways. But last thing I'll mention, I won't go into it a lot, but in case anybody is more interested in understanding the category of neo-traditionalism, and specifically from the standpoint of politics and political ideology, Wala Qaisi talks a lot about this in her research, and she focuses on the political approach of these scholars. But I want us to transition to talking about really one of the central questions and discussions in the book, which is the Sunni position on political revolution, on rebellion, on khuruj, against the ruler, and how the scholars in this book really turn to that discussion and the discussion of the traditional Islamic sources and evidences, the fiqh evidences for khuruj or against it, when talking about the Egyptian protests and the Egyptian revolution, and how that really became just what a lot of the discourse was focused on, at least in the way that Al-Azami presents it. When it came to legitimizing or delegitimizing the protesters, legitimizing or delegitimizing the regime and the coup, the Morsi presidency. So what are your guys' thoughts on the way that he approached that discussion?
So I appreciated the breakdown of how the same hadith and scripture is used by different scholars to convey their different opinions. Especially because none of these scholars are narrating from a neutral point, right? They all have their own, not agenda per se, but they have a different background. If we go straight into an example, the Quran states God does not change the condition of a people until they first change that which is in themselves. And Dr. Azami provides two commentaries now, one by Sheikh Qaradawi and one by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And Sheikh Qaradawi's exegesis takes it as these are a people who have suffered to the point that they no longer fear the fears of this world, and something within them has changed, and they realize that they must act, and they have they become determined. There's a hope in them. There's something in them has kind of made them stand up and realize that it is them who must change their conditions, and Allah will give them the means to do it. So he kind of focuses on the inner state, but also that inner state will provoke a change by the hands. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, however, cites the exact same verse, but he does so in a context where it seems as if the people were to blame for the corruption of the rulers. And he essentially claims that the verse says that the people must change themselves and not their government, which so many obviously revolutionaries are insistent on, and that the revolution starts within, he says, whilst pointing at his heart. So he's very, very much focused on the inner state. And I will add here that that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf was initially pro-revolution. And it's not that people can't change and their opinion doesn't stance or develop or grow. It's just that, at some point he did think that change with a hand was something that was permissible and, useful in this context. Arguably, though, neither interpretation is wrong. Or rather, actually, both are correct. But the timing and the context of these comments is something that is very significant. And if you have kind of to look at who these comments serve. And there's almost a divide created between the spiritual and then the political realm, where, they're pretty much intertwined, I think, or should lead each other. Anyway, I would argue here that in the context that these comments were made, there is the potential of complete disillusionment of the public with the scholarly class. We are talking about poverty, police brutality, just complete hopelessness, and people are just seeking immediate change because, but then they are being told to focus on themselves and their inner state, and, that some of them are even being blamed for the situation they are in. And this is something we've noticed in other spheres too, where, for example, Muslim women are seeking solutions from ideologies like feminism because our scholars have not provided them the support they want or need, or just adequate support. And desperation can sometimes push people to do the most unimaginable things, right? So you should never really push people to a state of desperation. But nonetheless, Dr. Usaama mentions that the idea that autocracies themselves may actually be the reason for the rise of extremism, despite aligning themselves as diametrically opposite to these extremist Islamist groups. The failure of democracy that has been so systematically engineered by political actors and the scholars who support them create desperate conditions, and these push people to extreme measures. For some, it may be self-immolation, For others, it may be joining underground, militant groups. But then the existence of these groups further legitimizes the authoritarian agenda to impose harsh conditions to tackle this extremism. So it's annoying. But when big scholars like Bin Bayyah and Hamza Yusuf established the Forum for Promoting Peace in the UAE, which essentially does act to legitimize autocracy, and are on the boards of the fatwa councils that are involved in normalization of Israel and declaration of Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, what are the people supposed to think of scholars as a social class who function as the guardians of the Islamic scholarly tradition? What should people think of the tradition? And just on the most basic level, let's say, how should a Palestinian Muslim who has endured for so long view the actions of these scholars? An individual who, in all honesty, only really has God left on his side, right, to help him, because no other Muslim nation is doing anything. Will they still seek to look to the scholars for help, or will they find other means? And it's just, they will lose hope in Islam as a force that can address their concerns and worries. And that's a big issue. And they may even lose their faith altogether, but at the very least, they may lose faith in the ulama as the inheritors of the prophets. So then who will they look to for guidance, for help, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, Amina. Something that struck me was really how the book, because obviously it takes that chronological style, shows how people's positions on this issue changed, particularly obviously Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And obviously I think, we this is implied, I think, for all of us, but perhaps some people need to hear it more specifically. But when, and we said, as we said in the beginning of the book, one thing that we appreciated that Dr. Usaama did was that he can talk about these scholars in a way that doesn't dismiss all of the great work that they've done and that they continue to do. And so when we're talking about any of these people, it's not because we think we are, more knowledgeable than them, but rather that obviously we have an Islamic obligation as well to call out something that is incorrect where we see it. So one thing that clarification issued, one thing that definitely struck me was how certain people's positions on the issue changed. Not because they can't change, as you said, Amina, but just that there was no explanation for the change. And actually, subhanAllah, we do know that some of these scholars now, I think, speak about this issue in a way that can be quite dismissive sometimes, and that act as though, people ought to have known that, of course, these revolutions were a bad idea, and of course these protests are haram, and of course these things, are well established. And it's almost as though, you've also held that position and you've changed it, and you're acting as though the lay people ought to know, if you are indeed somebody who is, of course, much more knowledgeable and much more aware of the details of these things. If even you had your position changed, why are we expecting so much of the masses in that sense? It was very interesting to hear about, how obviously, again, Hamza Yusuf on his blog was talking about being so supportive of people in the streets, being so supportive of Libya in particular, which, subhanAllah, look at how that descended and turned out. And even invoking, the US Constitution, I think, in parts, or the US, the history of civil rights movements in the United States as a comparison. To go from that to then kind of to then not even rebuke people for revolution, forget revolution, but even castigating or condemning the rulers, just verbally, and that people should be grateful and that we should, be honoring our leaders. It's a huge 180 turn. And I think that the lack of, explanation for that was very, very apparent as the book documented. I think the other thing that, in terms of this discussion of the Sunni position on revolution, that again really showed me how, whilst, as you were saying, Amina, there are different ahadith that scholars are drawing on and taking different interpretations. I think Dr. Usaama also showed very well how when certain hadith cannot be used to justify a certain position, sometimes scholars are willing to actually kind of, advocate for a new position and a new understanding of the deen entirely. And he narrates a particular instance where Sheikh Abdullah Bin Bayyah, who is obviously a very, very famous, very knowledgeable Mauritanian sheikh, and obviously the sheikh of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, after a few months, after kind of legitimizing executive absolutism, this is what Dr. Usaama calls it, which I think is best language to express the nuance and the balance that we're getting at. A few months after he had made some of these excuses in 2012, in February 2013, Sheikh Bin Bayyah goes to a conference, an academic conference in Kuwait that he had organized. And he had invited scholars from, across the region to this conference. And he starts basically trying to provide jurisprudential proof for his position that rulers should be obeyed pretty much no matter what. And in doing this, he, presents this as part of his thinking on fiqh al-waqiyah. This is fiqh of the reality. But essentially what he advocates for is that in Islam, the ruler is to be empowered over and above Islamic jurists even, to decide how Islamic law should be applied in practice, because this is something based on the reality that only the ruler can really have an opinion on. Only he can decide and he can judge. And Dr. Usaama talks about how this was received by other scholars, other very senior shuyukh, very knowledgeable people who were quite surprised that he was essentially advocating that Islam become subservient to the reality. And, really, this is a situation that all of us have in our lives, that if we have a choice between a certain reality and obeying Islam, we try our best to change that reality. If we're not allowed to wear hijab in school, we go to a different school, or we try and find a place where we're able to actually practice our deen. We don't think, okay, well, the reality is not is not helpful in me practicing Islam, therefore I'll get rid of it. And it's this kind of logic that is being used here, but with the idea of the ruler as the person who should decide. So even in that context, in the context of people facing a difficult reality, they would at least turn to a jurist or look for a fatwa. I cannot wear hijab in this particular situation, or this dangerous for me to do this particular action, or fast in this situation, or whatever the reality is. You would go and you'd seek a scholarly authority to get permission to change it. What Sheikh Bin Bayyah is advocating here is that the ruler doesn't even need to ask a scholar. He doesn't need to ask a jurist. And to me, having this written down, on paper, seeing it in black and white, was very indicative to me of the extent and why these conversations can be so dangerous. That ultimately you can even get scholars legitimizing changing Islam for the sake of a reality, to be very blunt about it. And obviously these things are, I'm not going to pretend to know the intentions of the people who are doing these things. This is not for us to judge. But that as a phenomena was something that I found very, very, very surprising. And again, indicative of why these conversations are so important. Because it's not just about the issue of revolution. It's not just about political issues or these really controversial topics. Arguably, this could extend to many other issues when you start to empower a ruler above all else.
Yeah, I think that particular point, Al-Azami does a really good job of picking it apart, and also picking apart the idea that the Sunni tradition has historically had consensus on privileging the ruler and disallowing any opposition to the ruler. He does a good job of analyzing the secondary literature about this in chapter 9, if anybody's curious about referring to it. But yeah, for me, when it comes to this discussion, what gets me is how it often comes back to the issue of khuruj, which in the language of the Prophet ﷺ's hadith, discouraging and prohibiting khuruj, what khuruj means is armed rebellion, taking up arms against the ruler to violently, physically oust him and to replace him. And first of all, there's no blanket prohibition on khuruj in the Sunni tradition. That's something that's established also. There's no doubt that it's highly discouraged and that there's very limited context in which it's allowed. I'm not gonna explain those. It's beyond my pay grade, but if anybody is curious, Dr. Hatem Al-Hajj has a really interesting lecture on the topic. If you just look it up on YouTube, he talks about like rebellion in Islam or something like that. But by the end of the lecture, what you see is that it's a lot more nuanced than it seems. There's not a blanket prohibition on khuruj, and there's also not this, encouragement to always be engaging in political action that could lead to chaos and that could lead to worsened conditions. But this is the thing that gets me, is that when the conversation always comes back to khuruj, when we're talking about protests, it brings it to an issue that is not necessarily directly relevant, because peaceful protests, which again, the shuyukh who were encouraging the revolution, who were celebrating it, reiterated constantly the importance of maintaining peace during the protests. That doesn't fall under the context of khuruj. So when when counter-revolutionary ulama or just figures try to bring up the prohibition of khuruj and the discouragement of it to delegitimize protests, it just dismisses it twists the reality, right? And it makes it seem like we're talking about something else when that's not really necessarily the issue at hand. But I'm glad that Al-Azami addressed it, because that ends up being a really like a keystone of the conversation, even if it doesn't necessarily represent the reality. But besides that, besides really representing very well how there isn't this consensus among Sunni ulama that one, that there's no context possible where khuruj is allowed, but also that these political protests don't fall under the category of khuruj. But something that I think also gets lost in that whole theoretical fiqhi discussion about what constitutes khuruj, when is it allowed, etc., is that like we stop talking about the conditions of the people and how people are suffering, how people are being tortured, how people face political repression, how they face political repression for peacefully speaking out, not even just in the streets, on their YouTube channels and on their social media. The degree to which like the current reality of police states in the Arab world, of surveillance, of the usage of surveillance technologies like Pegasus, which of course is produced in Israel of all places, like that reality is completely dismissed. And then we have this theoretical discussion about not rebelling against the ruler, and even people going so far as to say that the ruler should be advised in private because you should give nasiha to Muslims in private instead of shaming them publicly. It just completely dismisses the reality of like on the ground, people are suffering, people are being imprisoned and tortured for very mundane statements oftentimes in Egypt and in other Arab countries, in the countries that helped support the like anti-Morsi protests and helped basically manufacture the coup and the counter-revolution.
I mean, just like literally on that idea of, advising the ruler in private, does the ruler have channels where people can actually advise him? I mean, some of these people who we're talking about are autocratic leaders who rule with like a cadre of the political elite. These people are not accessible. It's not like pre-modern times where, you can go and visit the wazir or the governor of a certain area. You can convey a letter. Like, do we know if these channels, has this been given much thought about, okay, how would you practically, somebody wants to go and advise somebody, how is that possible? Whether they're shuyukh or whether they're average people, where does the responsibility of the ruler to have those channels open come into the conversation? Is it just that we need to keep theoretically advising in private? What if that's never going to happen? Then, then what happens? Surely advising in public would be the next best option.
Yeah, first of all, the real kicker is that the people advocating that are like the very small select group of people who have private access to the regime, and what they do, in those conversations, God knows what kind of nasiha they're giving them. I hope it's good. But what does it look like from the outside? It looks like legitimation. It looks like praising these regimes, literally giving out statements saying that the UAE is a tolerant, peaceful, productive government, whatever. But also that I don't know where even the argument comes from that public nasiha and public outcry and speaking truth to a tyrant is disallowed. In fact, I find a lot of evidence for the opposite. And yeah, back to this point about just dismissing the injustice on the ground, is that you find no shortage of texts in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in the examples of the Sahaba, about how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala despises injustice and how much he despises tyrants, and how much the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to speak out against them. And this is really highlighted in I think this is in the first or second chapter where Al-Azami is talking about like one of Sheikh Qaradawi's one of the episodes of his show following the Tunisian Revolution, where he spends a lot of time talking about evidence in the Islamic texts against injustice and for speaking out against injustice. He mentions several ahadith, one of them that we all know, that the best jihad is speaking the truth in the presence of a tyrannical ruler. Also that the Prophet ﷺ said, if you see my ummah fearing to say to a tyrant, "O tyrant," fearing to call him a tyrant, then they have been bidden farewell. And then this one that really struck me was that when the Prophet ﷺ said, the master of the martyrs is Hamza, radiallahu anh, then a man who stands up to a tyrannical ruler commands him to do what is right, forbids him from doing what is wrong, and so he kills him. So the tyrant kills that individual. This one really struck me because in a lot of, connects back to what you were saying, Aisha, about how in hindsight people talk about the Arab Spring as though it was an obviously going to lead to failure, and how the people who engaged in it are accused of being, suicidal and foolish for standing up to their rulers, again, through peaceful protests, not through armed rebellion. But here the Prophet ﷺ is saying that this person is, that the person who goes to speak that word of truth and then is killed as a result is a master of the shuhada. So not in the hadith, it doesn't say anything about this person not having calculated the consequences accurately enough, standing up to someone who's more powerful for them, which is stupid, and that, they were basically asking for the adverse consequence. No, that the person dying as a result, all, if anything, it just testifies to, you know, their courage, to their bravery, and to them not like fearing that tyrant. And it also connects back to Sheikh Qaradawi's interpretation of the ayah about how Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change themselves. This is a person who was trying to change their condition and trying to do so through improving the rulership. In light of that, I just want to re-emphasize Amina's previous point about how if ulama, if people who are claiming to speak on behalf of the deen continue to ignore the actual suffering of people and just repeat these platitudes about how khuruj is haram and how opposing someone more powerful than you is just suicidal, and you're just basically asking for adverse consequences, you're bringing more suffering onto yourself and onto people. If this continues to be the rhetoric that people hear from ulama, people will eventually decide, okay, if that's what Islam says, Islam is very impractical. It doesn't address my conditions, and I'm going to find alternative means to improve my material reality. It makes Islam irrelevant. It makes it defunct on a social and political level. So I think that can't be lost in the discussion. We can't stop talking about what are these people actually facing, and that theoretical fiqh discussion is extremely important, but it's not the entire conversation.
Yes, exactly. You know, I don't think it's a thing of cancel culture, rather that there is a natural response to seeing a scholar who has taken a questionable or harmful stance, that you will naturally feel disillusioned by them and not really want to engage with them. You know, there's almost an intimate connection in the scholar-student relationship, and it's built on trust and, you know, admiration. And I think in new trad and Salafi circles especially, this relationship with the ulama is super sacred, which is why people get, you know, very emotional or have very strong opinions about the ulama and, you know, like a protectiveness over them. But politics is a big part of our dominant culture. And, you know, it's difficult to remove it from faith. You know, don't make everything political, because, you know, everything is political most times. And it really does impact a lot of our lives and situations directly. So then, you know, having a scholar that you learn from, that you take from, you know, it will either transform your experience or really ruin your experience when they aren't on the same wavelength, or, you know, they are like totally off on a whole different wavelength and really wrong. But, you know, it's just, I think that's part of human nature. A sense of betrayal is deeply impactful. And I guess we can choose the scholars we take from. So, you know, it's not cancel culture, it's just, you know, going to someone who fits you better. But, you know, approaching it in good faith, I think it's important to differentiate between not saying anything at all and speaking for the state directly. And I don't think they should be synonymized, even though silence can often be deadly. You know, I read Graveyard of the Clerics recently by Pascal Minoret, and the manner in which they disposed of scholars in Zayli, subhanAllah, like people were charged purely on the basis of association and just isolated interactions. And, you know, they're scholars, they're going to interact with numerous people, right? And, you know, it's a question that we can even have Saudi-based scholars anymore, in the sense that, you know, the slightest dissent from state policy is criminalized. And this will obviously seep into what they are teaching others and their training. And, you know, Maqdisi calls it a graveyard of the clerics and a prison for the preachers. So in this context, those who do speak up, I have the utmost respect for them. You know, I think of Sheikh Salman Al-Awda like often, and you just, you know, in our history we have so many righteous scholars who have been in prison for speaking the haqq. You know, like Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah, Sheikh Ahmed bin Hanbal, like, may Allah honour them, because to sacrifice the comforts of life to stand by truth and justice is difficult. And that's why I think scholars who are able to safely forbid evil, you know, and enjoin good, at the very least they need to make their positions clear. If nothing else, it will, you know, at least dignify the oppressed and their plight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to some degree, I mean, you guys tell me your thoughts on this, but I see that happening with particular scholars, you know, some of whom are mentioned in the book, that I, you know, speak to people and they're like, well, I don't listen to that person anymore because he said X, Y, Z. And, you know, that's not a good approach to take either, because everybody has good and bad that they can, you know, in them, and everybody has there's some benefit you can take from everyone. But where people feel like, you know, you are denying my struggle, you're denying my reality completely, how can I take you seriously? How can I believe and trust anything else you say? You know, I can understand why they would come to that conclusion. I think, you know, we need to look above it and we need to find the benefit, but that takes a lot of self-control and a lot of taqwa and a lot of sincerity on the part of, mashallah, people like Dr. Usaama, who can obviously, you know, criticize whilst taking the good. But that's a big expectation to have from people who are really living in very desperate situations, and they have somebody criticizing them, looking down on them in that situation because of actions that they've taken. And then it's a huge disappointment, because like you're saying, they go and, you know, and then people complain, oh, why are people, you know, going into this left-wing activism? Why do people try, you know, and go down the route where they are appealing to these politicians and people who appreciate their struggle and ally with them? Perhaps it's because scholars, that when they looked to scholars, they didn't give them advice that was helpful. And instead, not even just advice that wasn't helpful, they criticized them for even complaining in the first place.
The thing is, I don't disagree with you when it comes to, like the whole like tossing the baby out with the bathwater point. But I think if I can push back a little bit, I do think that in some cases it is justified to stop taking knowledge from certain people when you notice a pattern in their rhetoric, and you notice that it's not like it's not an isolated incident, them like speaking against the revolutions or against the protests or talking about khuruj when that's not even what's happening, but you notice certain patterns in just the way they talk about oppression, the way they talk about people who are facing poverty, people who are like in the wake of colonialism, how are they dealing with their situations? When you notice a pattern and how they tie it back to aqidah, even they tie it back to how the reason that people are suffering is because actually they're bad people, and so their material conditions are a reflection of their spiritual state. I don't blame people for no longer trusting that person to give them sound spiritual advice, especially when a figure like Ali Gomaa, who is like, his comments are thoroughly discussed in the book, how not only does he go so far as to, make those statements, but there's like plenty of evidence of him saying one thing in private and then contradicting himself in public, of him using the exact same ahadith and ayats to say opposite things, to say that the protests are wrong and that they're going against a legitimate ruler, and then to justify the coup and say that, well, actually the coup is justified in this case, even though democratically elected leader you would think would have more legitimacy. Sheikh Qaradawi also gives a very explicit statement that this is mentioned later in the book, where he says that like you can't take from certain people anymore. If people are compromised because they're an arm of the state, which as the book presents Ali Gomaa definitely is, in that his rhetoric aligns 100% with what the state wants and the state's interests, and with justifying things that are like blatantly wrong, blatantly haram, then those people are no longer people to take any type of knowledge from. So there's a whole spectrum, like what you're talking about, Aisha, that yes, there's certain people who, like, I have teachers who maybe I don't necessarily agree with all of their political stances, but it's not to the point where I distrust them and I can't take any knowledge from them on Islam, because but there are other shuyukh who I used to really enjoy listening to, and then the more I listen to them, the more I realize that like for some reason they managed to like insert this point about like people being responsible for their own oppression and being responsible for their own suffering into everything, not in just political discussions, but even in like tazkiyah discussions. So I just want to I make excuses for those people if they do decide,
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is the thing. I think, subhanAllah, like you said, there's absolutely red lines. And definitely when you sanction or endorse or do not condemn in any way, the bloodshed of people who are absolutely innocent, that's 100% a red line where you need to seriously question whether that person is in a position that they can be, teaching authority, with teaching Islam with any kind of authority. The same way that, people who we hear about who are accused of spiritual abuse or proven to have engaged in spiritual abuse, you don't no longer, are able to trust what they're saying. Absolutely, for sure. Yeah. I guess I was referring more to kind of people who, they're not acknowledging people's struggle, like you're saying, sufficiently, where they make excuses for, their oppression and things like that. And that's obviously 100% wrong. But that's exactly as you're saying, that's turning people away from taking whatever elements of good, but not even just elements of good, but from the fact that Islam has potential solutions. Instead, as you said, they look for solutions elsewhere. And that's definitely a problematic trend that both you and Amina have identified.
And all of this kind of looks at the concept of trust in the scholarly class. And that is something that is really important. And I think Dr. Usaama highlights, maybe inadvertently, but by looking at the use of the weak hadith and its also, authenticity, it's something that Dr. Usaama is qualified for as an alim, but also because this is something that, not something that the civilian population can gauge themselves. It's not something that I can gauge, as someone who is like very, very early in her Islamic studies. But, we're distrusting of the scholars by virtue of them being scholars, that they are conveying things in the way that is most just and most accurate. And I'm not saying weak hadith don't have a place in discourse. And there's lots of ikhtilaf on this as well, but highlighting a trend that it is mostly the counter-revolutionary scholars who are using these hadith as frequently as they were. It's just a point to be noted. Especially just because, it is religion that is being used as a tool by both sides to persuade the people, to sway the people, to, to push their side of things, right?
Yes, absolutely. And on that point, I also want us to reflect on just the role of ulama in politics, because it's one thing to say that they discuss these things from a fiqh standpoint, or that they have differing positions, that they have different interpretations of the classical sources, but then there's a next step of that, which is, okay, what real life impact does that have on the political situation, on people, on regimes? So what is the, what degree of influence do they have? What are the limits of their influence? What do you guys think?
I mean, I think it's obviously very case specific, depending on the place and the particular relationship that obviously ulama have with the state. And very often, I mean, this is the interesting thing, I think, that when I speak or when I read literature, especially, from Western commentators and policy analysts and academics, for decades, particularly on Saudi Arabia, they love to make out that it's the shuyukh who control and impose a Wahhabi, theology and practice on the rulers, and they're the ones with the actual power. And yet, subhanAllah, we've seen in the past few years how obviously the state really always was the one who, it was a mutually supportive relationship. But when the state decided that they wanted to downgrade the role of Islam and they wanted to liberalize certain aspects, they were completely able to do that. And they didn't care how many scholars they had to chuck in a prison in order to, and get the justification that they needed for that. So I think it's clear in general that at the moment, at the very least, it's the state that has the upper hand. But I think that Dr. Usaama makes a really fantastic point, literally in the last page almost of the book, where he talks about how autocracy in the political sphere and autocracy in the religious sphere are interrelated, and it's almost like a vicious circle that they kind of contribute to one another. And how autocracy in both of those spheres are going to stunt the development of Muslim countries and Muslim societies as a whole. And he makes basically the point that essentially the ulama have a role to play where they could break this vicious circle of autocracy in the political sphere and the religious sphere by embracing more open debate. Obviously, this is not to say that we have red lines. Absolutely, there are red lines in Islam with how much we can engage with people that come from different traditions. But we're talking about intra-Muslim dialogue, intra-Muslim discourse, right? And definitely when we look at the Islamic tradition in general, I think we can say that it is one that is characterized by epistemic openness. Not that we start taking other ideologies and we start taking other worldviews on board, but we're open to the contributions of other civilizations. I mean, when we talk about Islamic developments in science and maths and astronomy and all of these fields that we talk about when we look at the Islamic golden age and scholars throughout history, we can see that they took different contributions from other civilizations, from the Greeks, from the Romans, from the Persians. And I feel like in general, the test of this world, we're reminded very often by our scholars, is not to just withdraw from the world. It's actually engaging in the world, but in a way that we stay true to Islam. And I think that sometimes, and this is just a more general point, that people are very fearful that if we engage with, people who come from different perspectives, we're going to lose our standing. But we should actually see that diversity within red lines is a beautiful thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us in Islam for the reason that we discuss and debate and that we are constantly engaged in thinking about the applicability of Islam to our daily lives. And that if we can learn something about the world from other disciplines, we should be open to that. Very often, of course, the ulama, they're engaged in establishing what is halal and what is haram. But this attitude of this is truth and this is falsehood, I don't think should extend to all intra-Muslim dialogue. Of course, the red lines are there, but we shouldn't, again, become absolutist about it. We can't become autocratic about every single issue, and we need to engage with people from different perspectives. And it's when Islam becomes a tool for that engagement, rather than caging in our dialogue, that Dr. Usaama suggests it can create demand for openness in the political sphere also. So religious authority becomes not a tool for authoritarianism, but rather a tool for people to actually, and arguably, they are dealing with God's word. So arguably they have the widest mandate to be authoritarian about a particular issue if they want to. But if they encourage debate about a particular issue, if they encourage people to think, and obviously, yes, within the bounds of Islam, within what is permissible, but they encourage that dialogue, how then can politicians constrict the public sphere and squash all demands for transparency and openness when the religious sphere is showing itself as open to that kind of discourse and dialogue? And I thought that was a very, very interesting point that he made, and something that definitely, he characterizes as the challenge that the ulama are facing in trying to bring about that liberty, not liberty in that idea of like liberalism, but liberty in that openness and that desire for accountability and transparency. And I think that is something that definitely the role of ulama, the role that they have in politics, I think that's something that they could bring to the table.
Absolutely, yeah. I like the way you put it, because, and especially when you mention, for example, like ulama as a tool, I think that's a good way to look at it as well, because I think people can exaggerate the influence of ulama in politics or just on social issues in general, to the point where people become very disillusioned with the fact that scholars are not talking about issues, and then turn around and then blame the whole ulama, scholarly class, for the existence of issues. And when a lot of the times, blame is fair, but not to the point where it kind of exaggerates or misattributes the roots of certain issues, and leads people to just distrust the scholarly class altogether. I think that's a problematic consequence of that. Mm-hmm. But also when it comes to just trying to assess what degree of influence do they have, there's one side of assessing political issues and the political status quo, which is looking at the structural factors, looking at the very broad spanning, deep-rooted issues and deep-rooted factors, such as international relations and diplomacy issues or economic issues. And then there's another part of it, which is to recognize that even in between all of those structural factors, individuals do still play a role. Individuals do still have impact and influence. I think where this was really clearly exhibited in the book, actually, was when Alami goes through analyzing Ali Gomaa's post and pre-Rab'a lectures that took place in private addressing the Egyptian military. And for one thing, it's interesting to think about, why did the military invite him to give these lectures? Why did they think that it was important and useful for an alim to come and speak to their soldiers and to give them Islamic justifications for the massacres that they were carrying out? And one thing that Alami mentions is that they probably sensed a degree of discontent amongst the soldiers themselves, a conflicted moral conscience amongst the people, the individuals, again, who are carrying out these actions, who could pose a threat to the state's interest by deserting, by deciding that we're not going to do what the state is telling us to do, and that having an alim come and give them religious justification for these things, comparing them to the Sahaba, trying to interpret some hadith as talking about the modern Egyptian military, these things have an impact. Who's to say that, if it wasn't for them receiving those religious justifications and that, that pre and post massacre pep talks, that they wouldn't have deserted, that they wouldn't have decided that, they wouldn't have reflected and realized that, okay, what we're doing is actually incorrect. Also, the ulama were actually, they aided the rhetoric that made it seem like the protesters that they were cracking down on were foreign actors and were armed foreign actors, and further justifying those crackdowns. So rhetoric from the ulama is important, and especially the way that they utilize religious sources to push certain ideas, whether it's on behalf of or against the state. So yeah, I wouldn't diminish that role either, even whilst recognizing that ulama don't have some sort of control over the state.
Okay, definitely, I agree. I think that you're right. We need to get that balance between recognizing the systemic problems and trying to, put the blame all on one group of people. But what would you say to people who think that, as scholars, because they have that position of religious authority in society, it's their responsibility to speak about these things, and, we have to hold them to account when they do speak, but also when they don't speak? What would you say to that?
I think I agree generally with that when it comes to very obvious issues of injustice, that's the responsibility of every Muslim. That, and the degree of responsibility changes depending on whether someone's safety is at risk. And that's why I wouldn't go so far as to attack individuals for just being silent because you don't know, especially if they live in a state with really repressive practices. Saying even really mundane statements that vaguely criticize the government or criticize the military can land them in jail or land their families in jail. We see this with Sheikh Qaradawi, Qaradawi has obviously spoken very openly, but his family, his daughter and her husband, were still living in Egypt and they were imprisoned. And I think she was only recently released after years of being a political prisoner. So there's one thing to note there, even though, yes, generally, I think it's it's very clear from the statements of the Prophet ﷺ that it is the responsibility of Muslims to condemn evil and to promote good. But when it comes to then going the additional step of, do we need ulama to talk about political strategy or political theory or politics in general, and to give recommendations when it comes to ideal, political actions or even, ideal ideal government structures when it comes to a more theoretical thing. And I think that as much as a traditional training in the Islamic sciences definitely gives a alim the training to talk about political principles or specific fiqh issues that would guide our politics and that would guide Islamic governance, that doesn't make them necessarily political theorists unless they specialized in that and unless they really researched those issues and also researched modern political theory and modern political situations, the modern political context, in order to be able to speak to those things in our modern context. I think that's a separate thing from like the traditional Islamic training. That a lot of ulama do have that training and are able to speak to those issues, but a lot of them are not. And they don't need to, I don't take the position that ulama have to talk about everything under the sun. I don't think ulama, if they're not medically trained, have to talk about like vaccine or anti-vax. And we've seen a lot of issues come up with that, actually.
Absolutely.
And we see it when it comes to politics also, where just like really absurd statements being made about like political theory and about political strategy. We see one statement in the book that Al-Azami cites where in promotion of constitutional monarchy, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf says, for example, that why he's in favor of it is because kings are incorruptible, unlike those who do not possess great wealth. Which, what's interesting is that he's saying this like during an interview, right? And then the presenter in the interview says, oh, so you mean like the nouveau riche? So people who recently come into wealth, they're corruptible, but not kings. And then Yusuf says, yes, like that. Such a person can be corrupted. As for a king, he's satiated. He has everything. He does not need anything. And this is supposed to be evidence for the fact that kings would not be corrupt people. And it made me start thinking about, like, do we have evidence that Fir'aun was nouveau riche? Wasn't he the descendant of, like a very long line of pharaohs?
Yeah.
But you see, like, statements like that where it's, if somebody actually thinks that, I don't think it says something about their moral conscience, but I think it's a very misguided statement when it comes to just political theory and history, and that can be very easily disproved by looking at actual evidence. So yeah, as much as I look to ulama as a Muslim layperson for guidance when it comes, and I look to them to speak about political issues and to speak about injustices, and it brings my heart ease when I see them speaking about those things, and it brings me pain when I see them silent about these things. I also don't look for them to give political strategy or recommendations on things that are just outside the scope of their training. I don't look to engineers to give me medical advice. I think it's comparable in that sense.
I just want to add one last thing that, someone said to me recently, when it comes to people who are very knowledgeable about Islam, that we should let them make the case for themselves of why they have said something or not said something, and not rely on, who we have seen them with or what we've heard about them, because there may be a wisdom that we can't see. And I think we do have to remember that the scholarly class is a distinct class in the sense that they have a power over the people in a way that the layman doesn't. They have access to resources and people that we don't. So it makes sense that they will be the ones who are closer to the leaders, the world leaders and the politicians. And honestly, who better to give that word to, like, Trump than a very knowledgeable scholar? But subhanAllah, this also means that this position of power, of the status, there's a potential of fitna. And for that reason, we as a people are owed transparency, and that we should hold them to a higher standard consistently, just because of the potential that they could be used as a tool for the state. And I've just had people who talk about, honouring the scholarly class and giving them the respect they are owed because of this distinct status. I've seen so many of them support and praise scholars who back autocracies that harm the scholarly class, who imprison scholars and kill scholars. Just how does that make sense? So in the spirit of honouring the ulama as a distinct class, I think we need to be critical of them and how they conduct their business and who they are associated with, but not in a very obsessive and nitpicky way, but just to maintain this high standard and to maintain a trust in them. And I just think evaluating what we deem a victory and a success is vital too, because, I don't doubt the motives that these scholars want good for Muslims, that they are playing a long game thinking they can maybe rack up like prestige and just like these positions that will grant them power. But it's Allah who will afford us ultimate victory. And I'm not sure what one scholar can do or what, scholars as a whole will be able to do in the realm of politics. But we need people to keep our hearts soft and our spirits high, and we need strong, courageous leaders, but that goes hand in hand with having strong, courageous scholars to raise and shape these leaders. And in a world that is, so increasingly forgetting religion and forgetting God, there is a lot of responsibility on the scholars of today to ensure that, we have an ummah that stands firm on the right path and looks to Allah for its solutions. May Allah guide us all.
On that note, I want us to conclude by talking about moving forward, knowing what we know now about the impacts of ulama on political realities, on the actions of both the people and their governments. How do we then navigate our engagement with ulama moving forward? What lessons can we take from this conversation, from this book, for the future?
I mean, I think one of the biggest lessons that I took from this book is that is one that actually Dr. Usaama talks about in the epilogue. A lot of, obviously, the book is about, contestations between scholars. And sometimes, it can get a little bit ugly. You have scholars making jokes about somebody's got Alzheimer's, somebody is old, somebody is senile, subhanAllah, and using that as a way of, we shouldn't take these people seriously. But I loved the fact that the epilogue in the book ended on what was much more practical note, but it also gave some really hopeful examples of positive engagement on the part of scholars that really reflects, I think, the unity that we need to prioritize now more than ever in order to move forward a decade on and to have lessons learned. The biggest problems that we face today are things that we need to face together, not fight with one another over. And I really loved the examples that Dr. Usaama gave of certain giants of, the Islamic scholarly class and of the tradition, of people from different backgrounds that had interactions with different denominations and took something positive from them. You should have Sheikh Abu al-Hasan Ali Nadwi, obviously, who is, a giant of South Asia and the tradition of Indian Muslim scholarship, who is, for all intents and purposes, a neo-traditionalist in his theological beliefs. But he's also been associated with a range of other denominations. And, he worked closely with, Abu Ala al-Mawdudi and his, political party, Jamaat al-Islami, which is often classified as something more Islamist or modernist or whatever. He is also, somebody who was in contact with major Salafi figures. We have even, subhanAllah, recent examples. I mean, I know I saw on social media recently a clip of Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad giving, a lecture alongside Sheikh Yasir Qadi, and both of them, praising one another and the work that both of them have done in their different respective areas. Obviously, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad is somebody who definitely emanates more from that neo-traditionalist denomination, and Yasir Qadi is obviously somebody who was trained at Medina University, but to my knowledge, characterizes himself as post-Salafi, but obviously is trained in an Athari understanding from a theological perspective. And to me, these are really great examples of how unity is achieved. It's not by being inclusive in the liberal way we understand inclusive today. We have red lines and we can take positions on certain issues, and we can definitely state when somebody has overstepped the boundaries. Definitely when there are sanctions of violence, made against other Muslims, or when we excommunicate people and make takfir on people. These are things that are clearly established in the Islamic tradition across all of these denominations, that once you do that, this is the sign of the Khawarij, this is the sign of somebody who is a tyrant, this is a sign of somebody who you should not listen to. Those restrictions and those barriers are there. But what we do not need are people becoming very attached to certain labels, becoming very sectarian, and becoming very exclusive. We talked earlier about how, every single label of the different camp, again, in inverted commas, that we were talking about, often speak about the other in a way that's very otherizing. And I think that we need to acknowledge that, people, that there is this diversity and in the Islamic tradition, and that's something beautiful. And there are different approaches that people have to political issues that we can also respect. We can respect, like you're saying, the one who chooses to stay silent. We can respect the one who chooses to advocate for a certain cause. We can respect the one who says, okay, who perhaps, puts the brakes on sometimes and questions, is this the right thing? We can even accept that to some degree. But what we need to accept, sometimes we need people doing different things. You need somebody to stand on the street and say, yes, this is you standing up for justice and for and speaking the word of truth to a tyrant ruler, like what Muhammad ﷺ praised. We need somebody doing that. And sometimes we need somebody saying, okay, what is the plan afterwards? Is this going to result in more chaos? How? But not in a way that condemns people, rather in a way that's productive, constructive criticism. This is what we need to engage in, and we need to see it as a struggle that we're all involved in together. Because really, so much of this intra-Muslim dialogue and unfortunately, it's not all dialogue, it's debate and it's argumentation, is very unproductive for us as an ummah. When people say, yeah, we need to unite, we need to think about that more than just rhetoric. But what does it practically mean to unite? It means we may have to tolerate things that we don't agree with, but we try and find areas of broad-based unity where we can work towards practical change in different spheres. This, for me, was actually what I took from the book, which perhaps people find surprising because it's, a book about different opinions and how this, subhanAllah, is leading to a schism that I think is becoming more entrenched in this day and age. Like, we obviously started off talking about people's opinions on the Arab Spring are so differing. I know sometimes I sit down in conversations and just from me expressing some positivity about it, people write you off as, oh, you must be, a revolution-aspiring Islamist who doesn't have any thought about what exactly they're going to do afterwards. But subhanAllah, these are the kinds of, deep-seated prejudices that we should be avoiding, and we should be learning from one another and working together. Perhaps that sounds idealistic, but I think it's better to be idealistic and inspire hope in one another than to be pragmatic and cause division.
Yeah. No, that's a really key point. And you said people might think it's ironic that that's what you're taking from the book. But I think that what the book does is it brings a lot of examples of people who like either approach the red lines or are like somewhere in the middle, or who are silent or who flip-flop. But then where it really, I think most of the book is spent talking about people who cross the red lines, like Ali Gomaa. And that's why we like set down certain barriers and parameters for who we are willing to engage in dialogue with, who we're willing to continue to take knowledge from. But beyond that, I don't think most scholars or most Muslims in general fall outside of those red lines. I think most people, despite a huge ideological diversity, whether that's in terms of fiqh and aqidah or just politics, I don't think most people fall outside of those red lines. I think that, but if we act like they do because they associate with a certain label or because they listen to certain scholars, then we effectively shut them out of being able to engage in any sort of dialogue. So if we acknowledge that, just have that, until people prove otherwise, assume that they don't fall outside of those red lines, that we can engage in dialogue with them, I think that'll solve a lot of the issues with people just being so frustrated, whether it's frustration from the ulama who are like, why won't people listen to what the scholars are saying? Why are they dismissing the role of Islam and the role of, actual traditional fiqh evidences in this discussion? And there are complaints on the other side as well, right? Of people just saying, why are scholars sitting in their ivory towers completely ignoring what we're going through, ignoring our complaints, dismissing our concerns as just obsession with dunya, or as complaining, or as failing to reflect on our own spiritual illnesses. So there's a lot of exclusive rhetoric that goes both ways that shuts people out of that dialogue. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned Sheikh Yasir Qadi, because I remember him talking about when he studied at University of Medina and how back in the day, I think either in the 90s or pre-90s, the faculty of the university used to be extremely diverse, and how there actually used to be a lot of ulama teaching there from different countries. At some point, they all got filtered out, and now the faculty is 99% Saudi. But yeah, I don't know if it's that we go through phases in the Muslim community of having more epistemic openness, of having more dialogue, of being more willing to take from people who studied in under different denominations or through different madrasa systems. And then right now, though, it does feel like we're in a very tight, closed, unopen environment. This is kind of like a, I don't know, Muslim internet meme thing, but there's this picture that goes around every once in a while of, I don't know how old it is, but there's this picture of a bunch of like some shuyukh and other just academics sitting around a table. And it's people who now probably would never associate with each other.
Oh my gosh, I know that photo.
Daniel Hakikachu, Yasir Qadi, Dr. Overmir Anjum. I think there's like 8 or 10 people in that picture, yeah?
Yeah, Dr. Jonathan Brown is in that as well.
Yeah,
and
so
Dr.
people
Shadi Al-Masri as well, perhaps.
I think so. I don't have the picture in front of me.
Yeah.
People could find it, but it's, I don't know, people always share that picture as like a point of nostalgia and also just confusion, like, how did this happen? But it just goes to show that would that picture be taken now? I don't think so. I can't imagine all of those people being invited to the same conference, let alone shaking hands and hanging out afterwards, this is not to say that I think everybody should be endorsed as like a wonderful person and invited to all the events and everybody should be given a platform. Yeah. But
and it's not an indictment on them. I don't think, obviously, many of them probably have no issues with one another, but like you're saying, they just don't frequent the same places or have the same audiences or, ascribe to the same, labels, as it were.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think now people are very quick to indict people based on who they quote unquote associate with. And association can be as much as oh yeah, they spoke at the same conference, therefore they're legitimizing each
Absolutely.
other's problematic views or whatever. So if that's the like dialogue that, and we're responsible for this too as lay people, for creating this environment of, very quick to cancel people, very quick to blame them for associations, very quick to blame other lay people for whatever, like ulama they associate with, whatever. It makes it impossible to just talk to people and to have very honest discussions. This is why I freaking love this book, because Al-Alami just puts it like it is. He's like, this guy said, quote unquote, XYZ in his speech. He said this, then he said this other thing. Then this guy responded to him and called him this. And it's so honest, and it's so refreshing in how he's able to be completely honest, say things like they were, without resorting to ad hominems, without being insulting, and without making it into, an exclusivist debate about who actually belongs, who actually gets to speak about the Sunni tradition, which camps should we take knowledge from, which camps should we include in our political discussions moving forward. It doesn't talk about any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you've said, I think it's just, perhaps because, alhamdulillah, again, it's a sign of progress in many ways. I think, alhamdulillah, and obviously as well, just progress of the world. We are now much more connected than we ever were before. And Islamic education has increased a lot, subhanAllah, over the past 100 years. The access to the resources that we have is on another level compared to even like 20 years ago, because of the internet, because people can go on YouTube and see different shuyukh. But very often that leads people to become more insular about who is it that you listen to, and people kind of interrogate you more about that. And I think that we need to be able to see the wood through the trees, essentially. All of this knowledge and all of this opportunity for connection should be actually to create those connections, not to break us apart, and address the big issues that we're facing. I mean, let's not forget the reality that started all of these events. Yeah, we are living as Muslims in the Muslim world. Look at the state of the Muslim world today. These are the issues we need to be solving, not fighting amongst each other about which sheikh is more representative of XYZ. Of course, those debates have their place, not undermining them. But I think the extent to which people are more concerned now, it reflects, I think, sometimes a misplaced direction that is almost reminiscent of celebrity culture. People who constantly talk about celebrities and what they're doing. The Muslim version is to talk about scholars.
Yeah.
What are they doing? What do they think? As opposed to actually, trying to better all of our conditions and trying to do that for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not, just talking about people.
Yeah, may Allah guide us to have productive conversations and to focus on the real issues, to defer to people of knowledge, and also grant us leaders and scholars who stay true to the deen and are connected to the conditions of the people. I also want to just ask people to make dua for the scholars and all of the Muslims who are still suffering the effects of the Arab Spring. I don't think it's right to say that it's over, or that I don't know, maybe some people don't even say that the Arab Spring started in 2011, but, that these events were kind of like broiling under the surface before it all came out at once. So to remember to make dua for people like Sheikh Salman Al-Auda, who are still imprisoned, tons of other shuyukh and activists who are still imprisoned for speaking the truth to tyrants, making dua for Muslims who are continuing to suffer the material conditions that they were first protesting during these revolutions, and to ask Allah to have mercy on all of the shuhada who were killed throughout these events that we were discussing today, and to never make light of those events. As much as, throughout the discussion, things can either get theoretical or even comedic, we never forget that this is what we're actually talking about, is the suffering of people, is the lives and deaths of Muslims. So may Allah have mercy on all the shuhada and make us Muslims who are worthy of carrying on their legacy and working towards the goals that they first started working towards. Ameen. And Jazakumullah khairan to everybody for listening. Please look out for further content from the Qarawiyyin Project, both our podcasts and our articles. If you have anything to comment, to add to the discussion, please do engage with us on our social media accounts. And with that, we ask you to keep us in your du'as as well, to take care. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.